Hi, I'm Brett Jones, and I'm a professor and motivation scientist at Virginia Tech. The purpose of this video is to provide you with an explanation of operant conditioning. Although operant conditioning isn't the sexiest new motivation theory out there, it's critically important to us in our daily lives, and the principles that have been identified over the years related to operant conditioning are as important to one's motivation today as they ever have been. It works on us whether we want it to or not, so it explains part of our motivation. Let's get started. The basic components of operant conditioning are really quite simple. The basic model is that an antecedent stimulus sets the condition for a response, which is the behavior, and this is followed by a consequence. Antecedent simply means that it comes before the response, as opposed to after the response. The basic idea in operant conditioning is that the consequence can be used to change someone's behavior by either increasing it or decreasing it. A consequence is called a reinforcement when it increases the response. A consequence is called a punishment when it decreases the response. These are the definitions. We cannot change them, this is just the way it is. Although behaviorists would say that a change in behavior indicates that the person has learned something, we can also say that the person was motivated to change their behavior. And therefore, you can see how operant conditioning is important to understanding people's motivation. We need to understand how a consequence is affecting a person's behavior to understand her motivation for doing something. Okay, so far so good? Now it gets a little more complicated. There are two types of reinforcements and two types of punishments. As I said before, if the response increases, a consequence is called a reinforcement. If the response decreases, it's called a punishment. If a stimulus is added or presented, it's called a positive reinforcement. If a stimulus is removed or subtracted, it's called a negative reinforcement. You can remember this by thinking of the way that the positive and negative are used in mathematics. A positive means that you add something, and a negative means that you subtract something. The same pattern applies for a punishment. If a stimulus is presented, it's called presentation punishment, and if a stimulus is removed, it's called removal punishment. The last column in this table simply combines the other two columns. For example, for positive reinforcement, the response increases after a new stimulus is presented. For negative reinforcement, the response increases after a previously existing stimulus is removed. For presentation punishment, the response decreases after a new stimulus is presented. And for removal punishment, the response decreases after a previously existing stimulus is removed. Now, one thing that students often have trouble with is identifying whether a consequence is a positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, presentation punishment, or removal punishment. So let's start by discussing how you can do this consistently, because it's really very easy if you're systematic about it. To identify a consequence, there are three things that you must do. You cannot correctly identify a consequence without doing all three of these things. First, identify the response. Sometimes it's called a response, other times it's called a behavior, but it's the same thing. Second, determine whether the response increases or decreases. And third, determine whether something is presented or removed. Let's do an example that will show you how these steps work. Jack hit Mia twice a day for 4 days. Because of his hitting, Jack's teacher did not allow him to participate in recess on the last day of the week. The following week, Jack hit Mia only once all week. What type of consequence did the teacher use? The response, or behavior, that the teacher was trying to change was Jack's hitting. You always have to start with the behavior that you are trying to change, which in this case is his hitting, because he shouldn't be hitting someone else in school. After the teacher applied the consequence, Jack's hitting response decreased because he only hit her once the following week, when he had hit her 8 times the previous week. Because it decreased, we know that the consequence was a punishment. Remember, that's the definition of a punishment, something that decreases a behavior. Finally, we see that the teacher accomplishes this by taking away Jack's recess. She removed something he liked. Therefore, it's removal punishment. So to summarize, the teacher used removal punishment by taking away his recess to decrease his hitting behavior. This is the same principle that's used in what some teachers and parents call time out, where kids are removed from a fun activity with the hopes that they will decrease their bad behavior in the future. Looking back at the table I presented before, this teacher's consequence is highlighted in red, and it was removal punishment. Now let me challenge you. What if Jack's hitting behavior had increased after the teacher removed recess? Then what would the consequence have to be labeled as? Pause the video to think about this for a minute. Well, because the behavior increased, it had to have been a reinforcement. That's the definition of a reinforcement. It increases behavior. Then we look to see whether something was added or something was subtracted. In this case, the teacher took away a recess, so it must have been negative reinforcement. The response increased after the stimulus was removed. But how could that happen? Why would Jack hit more if he thought that his recess was going to be taken away? Well, a likely reason is that he doesn't like recess for some reason. So the teacher thought that she was using removal punishment by taking away something he liked, a fun recess. But in fact, her decision to take away recess worked as a negative reinforcement because Jack didn't like recess, so he was happy that she took it away. He might not like recess for a lot of reasons, including that he didn't have any friends to play with during recess, or maybe he was being bullied on the playground during recess. This example demonstrates some important points. Sometimes we don't know whether a consequence is going to be a reinforcement or punishment until we try it and see what happens to the behavior. Taking away recess could either be a punishment or reinforcement, depending upon how Jack acts. An effective teacher would have already observed Jack at recess and would have been able to predict whether he would like having recess taken away or not. It's important for teachers to be able to accurately predict how their consequences will affect behavior so that they can use them appropriately. This also leads to another important point, that the same consequence can have different effects on different students. Some students might love recess and would do anything so that they wouldn't have to miss it. Others may hate recess and wish that it were taken away. Which brings us to my last point about this. Negative reinforcement isn't something most people can readily identify without following the steps I've presented, while positive reinforcement tends to be an easier concept for people to understand. I find that few people could tell me that taking away a recess is an example of negative reinforcement if the student's behavior increased. So please follow these steps logically to determine whether a consequence is a reinforcement or punishment. The final big point that I want to leave you with is the critical importance of catching students being good. After you catch a student being good, give them a reinforcement they like. This doesn't have to be something big. It can be verbal praise, a smile, a thumbs up, a sticker, or more time on activities they like. It's a positive reinforcer if their behavior increases or stays at a high level. Positive reinforcement is important for a positive classroom climate and motivating students because it works better than punishment over the long term. Teachers don't want to be in a situation where they have to continually use punishment. Doing so is tiring for teachers, as well as the students, and it just doesn't work that well in the long term. Of course, punishment is needed sometimes to reduce or eliminate a behavior immediately. I'm going to end this presentation with 2 examples of positive reinforcement, given that reinforcement is a better motivator than punishment in the long term. Consider this example. Darren's teacher notices that he is really concentrating on his assignment today. This is unusual for Darren because he usually talks to his friends during classwork. She wants to motivate him to continue to concentrate like this in the future. So she walks over to where Darren is working and says, "I really like the way that you're focusing on this assignment. You're really making good progress on it." Darren likes the attention that he receives from his teacher, and the next day he concentrates again on his assignment. How do we know if this teacher is using a type of reinforcement? Well, let's go back to the 3 steps that I told you about before. First, identify the response that she wants to reinforce. In this case, it's the fact that Darren is concentrating on his schoolwork. Next, determine whether the response increases or decreases. It increases, so it has to be a reinforcement. And finally, determine whether something is presented or removed. She adds verbal praise that he likes, so it's positive reinforcement. Okay, let's do one more example. In this example, Mrs. Bird's class has been a challenge for her this week because they're not being very good at paying attention to her directions. Today, however, the students are listening to her directions and things are going very smoothly. So to motivate them to continue this behavior in the future, she says, "Because you all have been listening so well today, you don't have to do your daily 5-minute homework assignment tonight." Let's assume that none of the students enjoy this regular assignment. The next day, students are attentive in listening to her directions. Here, the response is listening to the teacher's directions. This response increases, so it has to be a reinforcement. When we look to see whether something is presented or removed, we find that she takes away the homework that they don't like. So it's negative reinforcement. Okay, hopefully these two examples help you to further solidify your knowledge of what a reinforcement is and how to identify one. Both of these examples used a reinforcement to motivate students to do something. Darren's teacher and Mrs. Bird used reinforcement as a consequence to motivate students. This is good because reinforcement is a better motivator than punishment. Note that to motivate students to increase their behavior in the future, it must be clear to them that the consequence is a result of their behavior. Then students understand why it's useful to behave in certain ways, because they will receive the consequence. Now I want to place operant conditioning within the big picture of motivating strategies that can be used by instructors to motivate students. The music model of academic motivation provides key motivation principles for instructors to consider when designing instruction. A more complete explanation of the music model is provided elsewhere, such as in Jones 2009 and at the motivatingstudents.info website. However, it's helpful for instructors to consider this model and how it relates to operant conditioning. The music model states that instructors need to ensure that students believe that they have some control over some aspect of their learning, understand why what they are doing is useful, believe that they can succeed if they put forth effort, are interested in what they're supposed to be learning, and believe that the instructor cares about whether they meet the course objectives. These 5 key principles can be remembered by using the acronym MUSIC. Operant conditioning is helpful to instructors because it provides guidance as to what instructors can do to ensure that students understand why what they are doing is useful. When students understand that engaging in certain behaviors will lead to consequences that help them achieve their goals, they understand that it's useful to engage in those behaviors. For example, engaging in a behavior might be useful for meeting many different types of goals, such as obtaining a future job because it allows them to learn certain knowledge or skills. Or, the behavior might be useful for doing well in the course, which would lead to good grades, which are needed to attend college, which would lead to a future job. There are a lot of reasons why a future job might be a goal for someone. Maybe they want the money, or the prestige, or to help others. Regardless, the important thing for motivation is that students understand why their behavior is useful to one or more of their personal goals in life. So to summarize, consequences can be used to motivate people to do something. Now in school, some consequences might lead to a better type of motivation to learn. Consider someone who is doing something that is useful for a future job, versus if it was only useful for getting a high grade to raise her GPA. Number 1 might motivate someone to pay more attention and to use more effective learning strategies than number 2, because they really want to learn it. So although behaviorism is useful for motivating students, sometimes we need to also consider other factors, such as cognitions, affect, and needs, to truly understand one's motivation. I hope that this video was helpful to you. I have links to other information and videos on my website at www.motivatingstudents.info. Feel free to contact me by email at brettjones@vt.edu.